A very good morning, good afternoon or good evening to all of you joining us on this call by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. My name is Filippo Veglio. On behalf of the WBCSD team, we are very grateful to have you all on the line over the next 90 minutes to dive into one of the hot topics, of course, of the moment, COVID-19, in terms of the long-term consequences of this pandemic for the decade ahead, as you can see on the title of the session. As we have people progressively joining the session over the next few minutes, allow me a few introductory slides to set the scene. First and foremost, to welcome my co-host of today, Julian Hill-Landolt, Director of the Vision 2050 Refresh project in WBCSD. We are both dialing in from Geneva, and we hope that we find you well in terms of safety and well-being, not only you, but also your loved ones and, of course, colleagues and partners all across the world. Looking forward to being in charge now for the next 90 minutes and to sharing these perspectives alongside a number of experts from international organizations and our corporate membership. This session today is part of a series, what we call the WBCSD Virtual Event Series, that takes place between April and July of this year to replace a number of logical cancellations in light of the pandemic, cancellation of more traditional face-to-face events, including our annual delegates meeting in Switzerland. We are running two sessions, two featured sessions per week, each Monday and Wednesday. And we hope that through those sessions, alongside a number of working group deep dives, we can provide you with ideas, inspiration, but also opportunities to exchange across the WBCSD community on various activities and topics that are being advanced throughout the work program and beyond. For anyone interested, of course, you are participating today, so you are very much aware of the website, but I want to underline again the website being available also for all of the documentation and recordings and other highlights of previous events that took already place over the last couple of weeks. A few housekeeping items, if I may, in terms of making sure that this with modern technology runs as smoothly as possible. We are recording this meeting for the purposes of being able to share the recording with you post meeting, but also with people who couldn't attend. I would please like to ask you to keep your microphone muted. That will help in terms of the quality of the sound and the clearness of the sound. And also please, a very pragmatic request to switch off the video function as far as possible so that we can save on bandwidth, which you never know on the various technologies for these webinars that they hold on. So of course, except for the speakers, we would please like to ask you to switch off the camera. We are also going to make available all of the meeting documentation, including highlights and slides and the recording. So watch your inbox 24 hours after this call for those summary elements landing in your inbox. In terms of participating from the participants' perspective, please feel free to use the chat function. That's the channel we would like to encourage you to use to keep things straightforward, and we will be moderating that chat function and monitoring it, of course, to synthesize or to tease out questions for our speakers. So please use the chat function. It's pretty straightforward to use, and looking forward to your questions or comments along the minutes and the hour that follows. One important household item is the antitrust statement reminder that we put up at every single meeting of WBCSD. This is an important element in terms of you being aware that we really must avoid any discussion of competitively sensitive issues, the issues that you see outlined here around pricing and costs, bid strategies, capacity additions or reductions in the future, or any decisions around outputs or discussions around customers. Thank you very much for adhering to those rules so that the meeting can run smoothly and without hiccups. Today's agenda around these long-term impacts of COVID-19 for the decade ahead. Introductory slides about the World Business Council, given that this meeting is open also to non members and any external stakeholder, and give you a little bit of that context for the session. And after that, we'll have our experts and speakers providing the insights, both from the research we have been conducting over the past months, alongside the perspectives from experts and member companies along the way. And then we'll do a short wrap up with a few housekeeping items again, and conclude 80 or so minutes from now. WBCSD, very shortly, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, an association headquartered in Geneva with offices across the world, regrouping 200 global companies with a united vision around the world in which 9 billion people live well within the boundaries of the planet, united also by the idea that there is an essential role and opportunity, if not responsibility, for business leadership to accelerate the transition to a sustainable future, and a very strong linkage between the sustainability agenda and competitiveness and business success, business resilience, business risk management, and business innovation. A very warm welcome to our members representatives who could join us this afternoon, Geneva time, wherever you are in the world. A very warm welcome in particular to you. We are very grateful that you can take the time away from your busy schedules and be with us. And here you see the slide outlining all of our member companies across 40 countries by headquarter and 20 industry sectors overall that are regrouped in the council. WBCSD, in a very, very short slide, is focused on the 6 programs that you see outlined here, deliberately targeting system transformation around the 6 areas: the circularity agenda, the urban infrastructure agenda, the energy and climate agenda, food and nature, alongside social impact, and what we call the redefining value agenda, looking at measurement, valuation, and disclosure of companies' performance, among other things, of course, on natural and social capital. So the work program is the one that you see outlined here. And for those who are interested in learning more, of course, a lot more information available on the WBCSD website to provide a deeper dive into what you might be interested in. The context for today's call is also set by a session we had only 48 hours ago, where we zoomed in into the emerging, the key macro trends alongside a number of wildcard disruptions that we have identified for the decade ahead. This analysis piece was presented on behalf of the World Business Council's Vision 2050 Refresh project, which is looking at refreshing this vision that we laid out slightly over a decade ago, and where we are in particular focusing on the decade ahead. How do you get to a sustainable world by 2050, and what is the role of system transformation? What is the role in particular of the next 10 years in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals? What are the next 10 years bringing along in terms of trends and disruptions? So for anybody interested who couldn't join us on Monday, again, you can find all of the information online, freely available for you to dive into. And I strongly encourage you to do it, as our speakers will also make reference to this session along the way of this afternoon. Of course, within that wider context and within the topic of today's session, of course, COVID looms very large. The impact, the magnitude, the speed at which it has risen in the agenda is quite unprecedented. I think slightly over 2 months ago, who would have predicted that we would be in this situation worldwide, with worldwide impacts across societies, across economic significant long-term consequences at the level of finance, at the level of public health, at the level of resilience, at the level of supply chains, and of course, probably which societal area is not touched right now by this pandemic. And of course, again, I couple the wishes of good health to all of you, and the idea and the drive of WBCSD really to react rapidly to this pandemic and to adjust a number of our areas to really rally our members behind a number of work program activities that can hopefully rally member companies, partners and experts around the idea that there is a space to catalyze, as we put it here, collective insights and action from business. We have identified the 3 areas that you see outlined here in the 3 bubbles. We're looking at vital supply chains with a particular focus on food systems to start off with, so food system security as one of the focus areas initially. We're looking also at what does a return to normal, or to the new normal, entail in terms of scenarios on employee health as well as business recovery. And last but not least, we're also looking at long-term impacts, and this is in particular the angle for today's call, long-term impacts in terms of the vulnerabilities, exposed, revealed by this crisis, and lessons learned that we can apply for better and stronger future resilience, and of course for the principles of stakeholder capitalism, which were emerging very strongly across 2019 and 2020. So this is basically the context also of Vision 2050, the refresh that brings this particular angle to the long-term impacts. So with that sort of a context information given in the first 10 minutes, we are now going into the second part where we are having perspectives from a number of speakers. We have alongside Julian Hill-Landolt, who will tee off with a deep dive into the WBCSD research with 5 or 6 slides. His insights will then be followed by perspectives from the 4 speakers who you see outlined here. We're very pleased to have this afternoon Geneva time Naoko Ishii with us. She's the CEO and chair of the Global Environment Facility. We have Benjamin Coombs, Assistant Director for Sustainability and Climate Change at PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. We have Daniel Litwin, who is the founder and MD at Critical Resource, which recently became an ERM company. And we have our colleague Mel Mellis, who is Director for Interregional Engagement in Fujitsu's Sustainability Unit. A very warm welcome to our speakers, and we will get to them right after my colleague Julian Hill-Landolt's perspectives on the WBCSD research. Julian, I'm handing over to you. I hope to see you on the screen soon. You should be popping up. Yes, there you are. So Julian, you have been leading a piece of research alongside many members who volunteered to review it, and you're sharing with us some perspectives today, some highlights before we go into the insights from our experts. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Filippo. Yes, exactly. As Filippo says, I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that we've been doing to think about how COVID-19 will affect the decade to come, very much building on the work that Filippo already referred to, looking at the macro trends and disruptions that will be affecting the 2020 to 2030 operating landscape for business. I've got this picture of a volcano erupting here, which I hear The Economist is also using one to describe what's going on at the moment in one of their articles today. So all I'd like to say is I got there first. We used this on Monday, and we used it to describe the disruptions that we've identified for the decade to come as part of the Vision 2050 work. And the metaphor is basically trying to say that we know that the volcano is there. We have some tools by which to measure its activity and to predict when it might explode, but they're not perfect. And the impact of the explosion, the eruption, will depend quite a bit on which way the wind blows, for instance, and a number of other factors. The important thing isn't to know that the volcano is there or that it might erupt, it's to have a plan if it does. Volcano eruptions are not black swans, they can be predicted. And neither is COVID-19. We knew it could happen. There are international bodies that were charged with monitoring our preparedness for things such as a global pandemic. And ultimately, being prepared for COVID-19 wasn't something that global societies were willing to invest in. And even once it was occurring, the cost of reacting appropriately to it always seemed a bit too high. So if you move to the next slide, Filippo, as we said, as part of our work for Vision 2050, we've been trying to create a picture of the operating landscape for the next 10 years in order to understand the environment that we'll be doing business in. Because if we're going to create plans to address sustainability challenges, then we need to understand the kind of environment we'll be doing business in if they're to have any success. So if you are interested in learning a bit more about that piece of work, then please do go to our events page where you can find more information on the sessions that we held on Monday, where we go into these things in more detail. COVID-19 has triggered multiple disruptive shocks and accelerated many of the macro trends that we had identified. It looks likely to accelerate or intensify certain trends, for instance, making an economic crash an absolute certainty, even though a slowdown was very likely to have occurred anyway. Essentially, COVID-19 is bringing things up the agenda that we were going to have to deal with anyway. And it's essential that we continue to factor these macro trends into the planning of our responses and eventual recovery from the current crisis. Go to the next slide, Filippo. Similarly, the current crisis is on a tragic number of levels, demonstrating how important it is to take wildcards and disruptions into account when we plan for our business strategies. There are so many potential interlinkages between these disruptions, and we are seeing how domino effects, so where one disruption triggers others, are a very real possibility. For example, we're currently living through the COVID-19 global pandemic. It is inevitably going to trigger some form of economic or financial crisis. It could lead to popular uprisings, even conflicts, and that in turn could lead to regime change, just to list a few of the kinds of conflicts that disruptions that we see being dominoed by this current COVID crisis. All this to say is that disruptions are likely to interact with one another in ways that create reinforcing feedback loops. If one of them happens, chances are others will too. If you get the next slide, Filippo. So today we're going to examine the effect of COVID-19 on the decade ahead in a little more detail. This presentation, as Filippo said, is based on a piece of work that we've been doing with our partner Volans to develop an issue brief on the COVID-19 crisis and what it means for the decade ahead. That's been reviewed by members of our Vision 2050 project, as well as other WBCSD members who are supporting the COVID-19 response elements that are being worked on by the WBCSD team. The issue brief will be made available next week, and it will form the basis for 2 subsequent outputs on long-term business resilience. However, it is not finished. We're in the process of integrating the feedback we've received from our members, and if anyone on the call should hear anything that you feel absolutely needs to be added or amended, then by all means feel free to speak up or write to us afterwards. This is not finalized yet, and we want to get it as right as possible, although within a time frame for it to be useful to our members. So without further ado, we're going to look at 3 things on the call today. We're going to look at how COVID-19 is revealing just how fragile some of our essential systems that our societies rely on are. We're going to look at how the crisis and the way that business responds to it could shape the decade to come. And finally, we're going to offer some thoughts as to how business can ensure that the global response to the crisis supports and accelerates the transition to a more sustainable world. Go to the next slide, Filippo. So firstly, the systemic vulnerabilities being exposed by COVID. Number 1, our dependence on economic activity and growth. The pandemic and the response to it have triggered a sustained drop in global demand and production. In most of the world, there's been a trade-off between the infection rate and the economic impact, and both have had a severe human cost. Although there are glimpses of a middle ground in places such as Singapore, South Korea, and Sweden. Nonetheless, most countries have curtailed people's movements, and then we have to ask the question, how can we stimulate a recovery if people are unable or too scared to go back to their normal spending habits? How do countries go back to normal in the absence of social protections for those who have been unable to work? The degree to which social stability and welfare is dependent on constant economic growth has become a source of vulnerability in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Number two, high levels of inequality within and between countries. People's experiences of the pandemic are determined in quite a large part by where they sit on the global wealth spectrum. Wealthy people and those in wealthy countries are likely to have an ample financial buffer or a strong social safety net and access to high quality healthcare, and those at the bottom have neither of those things. Inequality acts as a threat magnifier, increasing the vulnerability of society as a whole. Furthermore, COVID-19 has exposed the extent to which changes in the nature of work and employment, particularly the rise of the so-called precariat, are a source of vulnerability. In many countries, the number of contractors, freelancers, and gig economy workers has exploded in recent years, and these workers have typically been among the first to see their livelihoods threatened by the pandemic. Thirdly, the weakness of norms and institutions that enable coordination and collaboration, both between countries and within them. The lack of coordination in the way that governments and other actors have responded to the pandemic has demonstrated just how badly norms and institutions designed to facilitate collaboration have been eroded in recent years. Transnational institutions from the G20 to the EU have largely been sidelined, and in the US, individual states and hospitals have been left to compete with one another for scarce medical supplies, driving up the prices for all. Given how contagious this virus is and how clever it is, a failure to confront the pandemic in all countries will likely lead to recurring outbreaks as and when economic and travel lockdowns begin to be lifted, as we're now seeing them being. Number four, underinvestment in healthcare systems and scientific research. COVID-19 has rapidly overwhelmed the health systems of even some of the world's richest countries, whilst also exposing how far from achieving universal health coverage we currently are in both developed and developing countries. Underinvestment is undoubtedly a contributing factor in many countries, and furthermore, scientific research that could inform better risk assessment and planning has also struggled to attract adequate investment in recent years. That's at the same time as it has seen a decline in its influence on public policy. And number five, too much focus on efficiency and short-term value by business. Resilient systems are typically characterized by the very features that efficiency seeks to destroy, so diversity and redundancy, or slack, for instance. This is a problem since much of the corporate world has been fine-tuning for the last 40 years to maximize efficiency. Furthermore, an excessive focus on short-term financial value maximization and an excessive build-up of corporate debt during an era of low interest rates has also left many companies ill-prepared to deal with an economic shock, such as the one triggered by the current pandemic. So those are some of the vulnerabilities that we see. If you move to the next slide, Filippo, we'll take a look at how COVID-19 could shape the decade ahead. And we'll do that in three blocks, starting with the interactions with existing demographic, political, and cultural divides. COVID-19 affects different groups differently. The old are more vulnerable than the young, men more at risk than women, the rich are better protected than the poor, and it appears that the thin are safer than the overweight. In some cases, the pandemic will exacerbate tensions, but it also creates a context in which building solidarity between groups whose interests are normally opposed becomes possible. Key societal fault lines that COVID-19 is interacting with in complex ways include, number one, income and wealth inequality. Currently, those at the bottom of the wealth and income spectrum are being hit hardest by COVID-19. They are least likely to have access to adequate healthcare, and many cannot afford to stop going to work, putting themselves and others at risk. Those at the top of the wealth scale are most exposed to the crashing global share prices, although this risk is likely to be short-lived, sadly. No, well, not sadly, but it is likely to be short-lived. Nationalism and globalism. At this point, there are few signs of effective multilateral coordination and collaboration to address the pandemic and its consequences, although the WHO continues to coordinate efforts in those countries where help is most needed. The initial response to the COVID-19 crisis around the world has highlighted the strength of nationalism and the weakness of multilateralism, and we're seeing tensions growing between important trading partners. Borders have been closed, critical supplies have been seized. Ultimately, solidarity will need to be chosen over isolation, as the pandemic will remain a challenge until the weakest countries have been able to bring it under control. Intergenerational dynamics. This is an existing trend that we looked at quite strongly in our macro trends work. While it is older people who are going to face the greatest health risk from the pandemic, the longer term economic fallout is going to fall disproportionately upon the young. Those hoping to enter the workforce for the first time in the early 2020s will be doing so in very adverse circumstances. Many will struggle to find jobs at all. Age cohorts that come of age during recessions tend to experience a long-term hit to their earnings, as we saw with those that came of age 10 years ago. And finally, polarization and atomization. There's a risk that all of these growing divides could lead to more polarization in society. That having been said, COVID-19 has also in many places brought local communities together, fostered a spirit of solidarity and mutual responsibility, and created a new level of awareness of our interconnectedness and interdependence. It remains to be seen how much of this spirit of solidarity will persist after the crisis ends, but it at least holds out the possibility of a bottom-up strengthening of social fabric. If you move to the next slide, Filippo. So the nature of emergencies is that they fast forward historical processes, and already the crisis is acting as an accelerant for several trends that were already underway. Firstly, reshoring. COVID-19 is prompting both companies and governments to rethink where critical supplies are coming from. The trend of bringing production closer to consumer markets, that of reshoring, which was already starting to happen as a result of technological change and turbulent geopolitics before COVID-19, is likely to accelerate as a result of the crisis. That having been said, digital activities may globalize more rapidly still. Looking at digitalization then, physical lockdown has accelerated the digitalization of many parts of the economy, including, for instance, e-commerce, remote working and schooling. But for those lucky enough to access these things, some of the behavioral changes and successful experiments that have been engaged in over the last 6 to 8 weeks will stick beyond the lockdown. Furthermore, the challenges and disruptions caused by COVID-19 are turbocharging the rate of technological innovation in some areas, from collaborative medical research to the deployment of 3D printing and design. In surveillance, we see many states having rapidly deployed existing surveillance technologies to help monitor and slow the spread of the pandemic. Emergency regulations that are introduced for this purpose may well outlast the emergency. That having been said, pandemic preparedness will spark a public debate around privacy, and that will be tied into a broader evaluation of individual rights versus collective rights. And finally, autocratization. During the last decade, the number of countries moving in an authoritarian direction has actually overtaken the number of countries moving in a democratic direction for the first time since World War II. Some authoritarian rulers are using this crisis as an opportunity to consolidate power and suspend democracy. Filippo, if you go to the next slide. So finally, how the COVID crisis could shape the decade, we look at the recovery, how the recovery might affect the decade to come. The design and implementation of government policies after the immediate crisis management phase is over will play a crucial role in determining what the long-term legacy of COVID-19 looks like. Households and governments will have depleted savings, and this will inevitably have a result on post-crisis behaviours, and similarly, financial institutions will need to rebuild their balance sheets and be therefore less able to invest. So the recovery, as well as the rescue packages, will play a crucial role in determining the legacy of COVID-19, and I know that Ben is going to talk about this in more detail later. There are lessons to be learned from the response to the 2008 crisis. The way in which bailouts seemed to benefit those who had caused the crisis created a strong perception of unfairness and sowed further seeds in support of the populist backlash we're currently experiencing. As per a recent FT article, if we want capitalism and liberal democracy to survive COVID-19, we cannot afford to repeat the mistaken socialize the losses, privatize the gains approach that we used a decade ago. But austerity and the bailing out of reckless and unprepared corporations is not yet guaranteed. We can still prioritize the interests of workers and small medium enterprises, who are the real engine rooms of our economies, And we can choose targeted public investment coupled with tax reform as a recipe for recovery. If you move to the next slide, Filippo, we've seen that the COVID-19 crisis is revealing weaknesses in our current system. And over the next decade, it's likely to accelerate some troubling trends. But it also offers the opportunity to add urgency and momentum to the conversation about our current model of capitalism that was already well underway before the crisis took hold 2 months ago. Shifting to a more stakeholder-oriented form of capitalism becomes more, not less, vital in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. The economic consequences will be to put a severe strain on political and social stability. Only by ensuring that the recovery is inclusive, benefiting all stakeholders, can we avoid a populist backlash against capitalism that would ultimately make the recovery slower and more unequal. Several organizations have already issued guidance on how to respond to this crisis responsibly in the short term. And these include doing things like reducing or eliminating dividend payments, establishing better balance between resilience and efficiency, from just in time to just in case, for supply chains and for financial management in terms of cash reserves, for instance, this all assuming that there are some strings attached to the bailouts that come. It's also likely that some greater interest will be directed towards quality and consistency of ESG data and the application of governance frameworks such as the TCFD. These will all be useful tools for building confidence and demonstrating future resilience as we come out of this crisis period. In addition, we need to work to put new models of partnership and collaboration between business, government, and investors in place. Post-crisis reforms will not automatically align with the SDGs and a 1.5 degree world. Collective ambition and leadership are going to be essential. There is no obvious source of demand at the moment. And while decarbonisation does indeed offer this, early signs suggest that we need to do a lot more work to make this the case. The next stage of the Vision 2050 team's work on the COVID-19 response project is to look at how we can give teeth to stakeholder capitalism. We're interested in how we can help companies to be more responsible, more resilient, and more regenerative. The rules and norms of shareholder capitalism undoubtedly undermined resilience at all levels. A lack of financial and supply chain resilience created by the relentless pursuit of efficiency, chronic underinvestment in preparedness for systemic shocks, incentives that drive companies to offer precarious rather than stable forms of employment, and to leave vital public services underfunded. All of these things need to be addressed as we think about the model of capitalism that is fit for purpose going forward. We'll be focusing our investigation on a number of areas where we have an opportunity to reset rules and norms. So going beyond looking at the normal areas of corporate action, such as climate action, inequality, circular economy, for instance, but also looking at the structural aspects of our model of capitalism, from ownership and governance to law and regulation and to pay and incentives. And while these changes may not seem to be the kinds of things that we need to be focusing on right now as we recover from COVID-19, they are critical to ensuring longer-term stability built on the foundations of a sustainable and inclusive recovery. So if you go to the last slide, Filippo, I'd like to conclude with two thoughts. Firstly, just to mention that this current situation is showing us what it is possible to do when we perceive there to be a real emergency. We're seeing the kinds of steps that governments, companies, and societies are willing to take when they think they really have to. The fact that they haven't taken anything near this level of action on any other challenge so far is something that we do have to take on board and reflect on quite seriously. But I'd also like to build on what one of our speakers from Monday advised, which is to draw from Eric Idle's famous Monty Python song of looking on the bright side of life. Crisis always drives change. If we look at any period in history, be it after the First World War, the Second World War, or other natural or cultural shocks, we see that change is indeed incentivized and turbocharged by crisis, and it can be magical. It's up to each and every one of us to drive recovery in the directions that align with our goals. As mentioned, we will at all times continue to evaluate the impacts of this COVID-19 COVID-19 pandemic in our work, keeping transformation of systems in support of Vision 2050, which is 9+ billion people living well within planetary boundaries, at the heart of our thinking and our guidance to businesses as to how to respond to this crisis and to our long-term recovery efforts. There are a number of pieces of work to look out for in the coming weeks. As I said, there'll be an issue brief on the macro trends and disruptions coming out next week, alongside an issue brief that covers the content of this presentation of the way that COVID-19 will shape the decade to come. There'll be an issue brief on stakeholder capitalism coming out in the coming weeks, and all will tie into WBCSD's broader COVID-19 response projects, including how we're looking at immediate recovery options in our return to normal scenarios project. So all of those things to look out for, and I do hope that this kind of thinking is useful to our members and the wider business community, and helps us to work through how we can start thinking about the really important areas that we need to consider when we are planning our response to this current crisis and to the future recovery that's required. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much, Filippo, and I'll pass on to you to introduce the speakers.
Thank you very much, Julian, for setting the scene with the overview on this issue brief in terms of the narrative and the key pillars of that narrative, and laying out perspectives and teeing up perspectives that I'm sure our speakers will build on, of course. So yes, as you can see outlined here, we have the pleasure of having the 4 speakers with us this afternoon, Geneva time, or this morning, Washington time, as we have the pleasure and the honor of welcoming Naoko Ishii, CEO and chairperson of the Global Environment Facility, which tackles environmental challenges through systemic change, and which mobilizes billions of dollars in grants and co-financing across thousands of projects across the world. Naoko Ishii is also very fortunate to have her also as one of our external reviewers of our Vision 2050 work, and we warmly thank her also for those inputs provided always through our former colleague Matthew Reddy, who is, I believe, also on the line. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to you, Ms. Naoko Ishii, for your perspectives from Washington, DC, with the Jeff hat on and with sort of the multilateral hat on at the same time. The floor is yours, and I hope we can hear you and see you well, so let's test it very briefly.
No, thank you so much, Filippo. Yeah, good. So good afternoon, good morning to everyone.
Hi.
Such a pleasure to be invited to speak to this audience. It's really, really my dream. Actually, I want to make 4 quick points. The first one is that let's think about what are the root causes of the COVID-19. We hear very good brief from Julian, and it's very, very useful. But one point which I really want to emphasize is that when we think about recovery or what we should do, that we need to really understand the root cause of COVID-19. And to me, this is really the collision between natural system and human system, because by now we all know that COVID-19 is basically that we put ourselves a human system so close to natural system, so that pathogens actually jump on so quickly, so easily from the wildlife to human. So this is actually the manifestation of kind of the global commons, the issue that the global commons in this Anthropocene, so that the solution is how we can continue to transform our economic system, human system, so that we can avoid this unregulated, that the deforestation, unplanned the human settlements, unplanned urbanization, and then under this global the trading the system. So I think it's very important for us to understand that the root cause of this COVID-19 is really the collision between natural system and the human system. So the fundamental solution to the COVID-19 is actually the acceleration of what this community has been already doing. This is a transformation of the human system so that we can continue to prosper within the planetary boundaries and but this time with a special particular attention to that this interconnectedness between natural system and human system. So I'm not talking about that sheer protection of the nature, but we are talking about how to make the urbanization, how to make that food system, how to make our development much more with the clear understanding of what would be the boundary, what would be to avoid this unnatural interconnectedness between human system and the natural system. So that's one point. So how we can actually respect the integrity of the ecosystem, which is the foundation of our prosperity. So that's the first point. The second point is that I hear the briefing is a kind of very, in a sense, very to try to shed the bright side light of what's going on. I'm a little worried about when we are at this tipping points and which way we were going, so can we continue to accelerate what we have been doing or try to do, or we kind of push back to the business as usual? When we started this super year 2020, that we are really upbeat and high hope that this time the nature or the natural system has finally capture the political imagination of the big thinkers, that the big policy makers, politicians, so that we can make a lot of good progress to understand this, the harmony between nature and the people. But the COVID-19, at least on surface, kind of swept out all of those kind of international meetings where we expected a good discussion, so that and living in Washington, actually US, we see so many policy reversal of the bailing out the old industry, or the removal, actually reintroduction of harmful subsidies, and the kind of temptation to deregulate the kind of regulation which we have been, the community has been pushing, building to do that transformation, let's say, food system. So I'm a little worried about that. To recognize that we were at such a scary point or a precarious point of which way we are going to. Are we going to successfully continue to push this system transformation, or are we actually pushed back? So that because the world has been so overwhelmed by this kind of that economic plight, which rightly so, by the way, but then when they continue to bombard this easy, quick recovery measures, we want to see the green recovery, but green swan, the green recovery, but not all the traditional conventional gray infrastructure. So, and then this the locking effect of this adversarial measures is so long and so massive. So I think that we shouldn't, for instance, wait for that dust to settle down, or the most difficult waves to be over. I think it's now that we need to come up with a good narrative, good science, and good measures to influence this this community. So that would be my second point. So that my third point is then it's actually that in response to your question, then what should we do now, and then how to reset the capitalism, what's the role of the multilateralism? On this one, I would use what the Julian said, that actually that the historian said, that the crisis can drive that good solution, or the crisis press that the fast forward. So in this case, this multilateralism is not even before COVID-19. We see that the traditional, conventional, that the multilateralism it's not really, international coordination built on by sovereign states is not really working. We have already started to see the new way of international collaboration or how to take care of global commons is much more multi-coalition of the committed progressive leaders from business and policy, political leaders, academia, the CSOs, that kind of multi-coalition, in my view, is the way to continue to promote the international coordination. Before COVID-19, I just want to make sure what I'm saying. Before COVID-19, that the GF is a kind of serving for multilateral conventions like climate biodiversity, has already seen the limitation of traditional international coordination or multilateralism solely depends on the sovereign state. That period was way before COVID-19, and we started to see this, let's say, that the multi-stakeholder coalition, multi-stakeholder, actually stakeholder capitalism in your word. So I think that the way to provide solution is we need to continue and we need to actually accelerate that kind of multi-coalition from the committed leaders from various parts of the globe, because what we try to do is acceleration of the system change, that to make sure the human system, natural system can be actually in harmony, and we need to accelerate. And then what does it mean? We need to continue to do this the resilient value chain, to continue to do the circular, much more resilient, continue to do this sectoral thematic coalition, either in energy space, city space, and food space, and whatever we have been doing. And we just need to continue to do it with this clear recognition that what we have seen is this, to actually strengthen our case going forward. So the no time to retreat and no time to wait for the people's mind to be back. It's going to be too late. So we just need to be razor sharp. And what we should do for the next, actually, that few weeks or months. So that would be my third point, my last point, and I stop. That what am I doing then on my side, on my part, GF, but actually kind of supercharged, the turbocharged, as somebody said already, with some of those key system change, the program like food and land use program, urbanization program, and the sustainable deforestation program, so that there are already vehicles which is actually built on this multi-coalition, the ideas, and many of you already are part of this coalition. I think this is good time to really to take the sharp focus, take a hard look at those the coalition, what can we do more to promote this and to accelerate what we should do. So, and then we come up with a kind of also the position paper in maybe 1-2 weeks time, but it's basically what, as I said, understanding the root cause of the COVID-19, and then to strengthen the acceleration with multi-stakeholder coalition, and with the sharp focus of this interconnectedness of nature and the people, and promote that transformation. But as you already said, to rebuild better or build back better with this new reality, that by now I think we come to know where we should strengthen more with high speed. So that I have a lot of hope to continue to work with you, that this group, you are already part of our program, and I am already part of hopefully your program, so that let us continue, and we have no time to waste. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Naoko Ishii. First of all, thank you so much for making the time at short notice available to share those 4 key points, and doing it in a very energetic and enthusiastic manner, also with a reality check about some of the limits to cooperation that we saw already before the COVID pandemic, but also with thoughts around how really to accelerate this systemic change, in particular around what you called this turbocharging change around this multi-coalition approaches. So please count on WBCSD to take this forward and to continue to work with you and your team in the Global Environment Facility to take this forward. I know you have a very busy schedule, so I think you have to leave us. But if there are any questions or comments, we'll make sure to forward them through your team.
No, I can stay until this session is over.
Okay,
so that
fantastic,
I'm here.
even better.
So that if there is any question or whatever, so I stay with you until this end of the session.
Absolutely. Then actually it's a good transition to our colleague in PwC, Ben Coombs, who is going to share some perspectives around what you said, Ms. Ishii, around building back better. So how do you really look at recovery packages? How can they be directed towards low carbon outcomes and sustainable outcomes? And so Ben, I'm going to hand over to you for your perspectives, building on your expertise, and I hope you're popping up on the screen and everything works. So let's check it quickly.
Thanks, Filippo. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, perfect. All good.
Great.
Go ahead.
Well, thanks everyone, and really interesting comments there from Naoko. I'm here at PwC. We've been thinking really about this from, well, many angles, as you can imagine, as a company and as an organization trying to help the specific crisis in question straight away. But we've tried to sort of think about what does the next 3, 6, 12, 2 years look, 12 months, 2 years look like, and really starting to think about the difference between rescue packages and recovery packages. And one of the areas that we think is really important is that when people are talking about rescue and obviously giving families food or a roof over their head, or the initial things, obviously for the healthcare crisis at hospitals, what's needed to be done around schools, that we steer clear perhaps of the sort of sustainability and green messaging on those rescue packages. But in the same instance that we sort of steer clear of that and let governments and institutions do what they need to do, when recovery packages are spoken of, more medium to long-term investment around building back better, that we get very heavily involved in those discussions. And I agree with Naoko that I think those are starting now, but we just need to be a little bit careful about where we put our emphasis. Of course, as businesses, we're responding to the crisis, I'm sure, through all of our channels, but in terms of building an investment, I think that's where the really big opportunity is to shift and accelerate that transformation. So that's one of the areas we've been thinking about, because in the financial crisis, I don't think we did as well as we could have done 12 years ago. I think you know, we maybe tried to get in too early with some of the rescue narrative, and others were thinking about other things. And I think we need to be absolutely clear that this is the planning for the 2020s, the decade of action, leading obviously up to where we want to be on net zero and other goals for 2050. The other area we've been thinking about is the sort of corporate bailouts and obviously the conditions that might be attached for those, for ourselves, for our clients, for whoever is involved in those types of activities. And you know, we would expect that to be part of the recovery story as well, in terms of the stimulus and packages that need to come there. And we would expect that there will be some conditionality in various places across the world. Some have already announced some, and I think more and more will come as people try to shift behavior. And there's that conversation about bailing out people, not bailing out capital. So I think that there is a big question around that, and something that we're actively involved in. I think on both the recovery packages, the bailouts, the conversations about investment and stimulus, you know, I think companies, business has a huge role to play. We saw the role that business played in the run-up to the Paris COP and the Paris Agreement. And I do think that the messaging around these areas, you know, if there is a consistent message from business about what is appropriate and what works, I think we will succeed a lot better than if there are, you know, disparate messages or just very much a let's firm up the status quo. So that's one of the main areas we've been thinking about, which I'm happy to take questions on. Of course, it, you know, links in very much with sort of finance ministries and central parts of government, but obviously there is a role to play through the whole economic and business system. The second area we've been thinking about is the impact of COVID on you know, supply chain. So it probably goes back a bit to Julian's presentation on his areas of sort of the bringing back reshoring, the bringing back manufacturing onshore, and the digitalization. I mean, we think it's probably those are really good areas for WBCSD and ourselves as a community to explore, because those are likely to have a huge impact on business. Notwithstanding, obviously, what's happening in the healthcare sector and all the things going on there, but business more broadly, the impact of the next decade on those two aspects is going to be huge. I mean, I don't think it's just about reshoring. I think it's also about simpler supply chains, less links in those supply chains, more resilient supply chains. And I think that, you know, we've had an endless pursuit of efficiency for 30 years, for sort of global efficiency, trying to take down every single margin. Are we going to see a movement to more resilient systems? And that goes, whether that's local production through 3D printing through to, you know, cross-national, transnational supply chains. We're also going to see with digitalization, you know, that there are opportunities now where people needed to be physically present in certain markets to service them. You know, is there going to be a big change in how we view virtual teams and virtual operations? So while obviously there could be a retrenchment physically, and we would, you know, to some extent expect some of that, and certainly a simplification, whether there is a retrenchment or not, I think there's a bigger question about what does the new digital world look like once everyone has sort of undergone 3-6 months of digital upskilling, which, you know, might have taken firms and companies many years to get everyone onto virtual platforms, and also on multiple platforms. I mean, you know, we're using all the different platforms, and I think that that's going to help as well with cross-national working. So I think there's that sort of interesting area of where does the sort of physical and digital go. There's also linked to those supply chains, I think there's a big question about the marginal and incremental nature of how our supply chains have been built. We've been built very much for just in time, where small changes can have huge implications. And, you know, we saw, not to mention obviously what our clients are talking about, but just looking at, you know, the Financial Times and Unilever saying on the front page the other day, you know, people are showering less and you know, using less products. I can't tell at the moment, and I didn't sort of, you know the full answers to this, but is that because people can't get to the shops at the moment, or are fearful of going to the shops? Or is that a longer term trend if people shift more to home working? Clearly not to the state we've got in lockdown, but even a 5 or 10% change in home working, does that shift, you know, demand and supply of goods and services across the world? And just to illustrate, back in the sort of 1979, 1980 oil crisis, it became a crisis because people stockpiled oil. There was a perceived supply disruption, which ended up being a demand pull, where people changed their gas tanks from being a quarter full to a half full on average, which caused a massive shock in the system. And so I think that, you know, what I'm really saying is small changes in price, small changes in supply. And actually someone pointed this out about, I'm not sure about you, but in the UK, we've had issues in supermarkets with various goods, pasta, toilet paper, those types of things that people have been hoarding. But what it showed is it was actually, I think someone did an analysis and said it was only demand increasing by 15%, 15%, that shifted it, and suddenly we had empty shelves. So I think that, you know, the resilience of these supply chains, how business is going to respond to changing dynamics and markets and consumer preferences is equally interesting for the business community. And as I said, just on both of those, I think these are going to be very sort of crowded spaces over the next 6 to 12 to 18 months. And I think we need to think about what is, you know, business's angle in here. Notwithstanding, I agree with all the other points about, you know, the interaction between humans and nature and all of that. I agree with all of this. It's just finding the right sort of messages to take into the fora that we're part of.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben, for highlighting the resilience angle, for highlighting conditionality and a number of other issues around these low carbon ambitions. And certainly interesting to see how recovery packages will unroll as the crisis rolls also across the developing world, and what are going to be some of the consequences also at multilateral level, what can be generated there in terms of momentum to really address these systemic challenges. So thank you, Ben, for that. I'm sure, and I want to remind again people after our first two perspectives, in addition to Julian's, The chat line is open. If you have any questions, clarifications, or comments, please don't hesitate to use it and to solicit inputs from a particular speaker or speakers along the way. So from Ben, we're going to move to Daniel Litvin. Daniel, as I said in the introductory remarks, is the founder and MD for Critical Resource, an ERM company. Has got some interesting perspectives around a handful of hypotheses about what this COVID or post-COVID context means for resource companies in particular. So Daniel, over to you to share those insights. And I'll drive along those 2 slides that you have prepared.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Fantastic. So yeah, thank you, Filippo. It's good to be in this webinar and appreciate the invite from WBCSD and indeed ERM to make this short presentation. So as Filippo said, this is just a few thoughts from Critical Resource, specifically on what the future might hold for resource companies, though I hope that some of it's of relevance to other sectors as well. And I think it is broadly consistent with what others have said so far, albeit a slight different focus of emphasis and perhaps a slightly narrower focus in a way on the corporate context and the immediate threats to companies. And it's based on a keynote presentation I gave at the World Gold Forum just last week, so hence partly the resource focus. So just in short, Critical Resource, we are a resource-focused advisory firm that specializes in geopolitical issues, in license to operate issues and ESG issues facing our clients. As of January this year, we are part of the ERM group, as Filippo has said, so, and we're very proud and excited to be so. We have a senior advisory panel that includes various key figures, including the Chad Holliday, the chairman of Shell, who I think is a former chairman of WBCSD, Rachel Kite, who used to lead the UN's, or recently led the UN's work on sustainable energy, and various other luminaries. So this presentation, as you'll see, it borrows from the title of the Aldous Huxley novel, Brave New World, from the 1930s, another period of quite intense political and economic and social change. It painted a very dystopian picture, of course, of the world. Hopefully, our future will be less dystopian. I should say that we are, as Critical Resource, we are. Well, I hope we're not being foolhardy. We may be being more foolhardy than brave in making these hypotheses, but we have specifically framed them as hypotheses rather than predictions, given the uncertainty of the world at the moment. And as I mentioned this morning, no one is allowed to sue us if we get any of this wrong in the coming years. So Filippo, on to the next slide, please. So just before the hypotheses, briefly to highlight a framework that we are using in discussions with some of our clients at the moment to support them to develop their own particular view of how the the immediate post-crisis world might look. To draw out 2 key points from this framework. One is that, and this refers to the left-hand side, that we think that given the scale of this crisis and the multiple potential knock-on effects, it's important to look at the very big picture trends, and also across multiple timeframes. So quite clearly, you've got not just the pandemic itself and the government responses to it, such as lockdowns. You've got the economic impacts, whether it's in terms of job losses, bankruptcies, government bailout programs, and then you've got the political and social fallout. And if the world is, I hope it isn't, but if it is entering another depression, economic depression, the last Great Depression, of course, of the 1930s led to massive political and social disruptions, whether it's in America with the New Deal, whether it's in Europe with all the political turbulence leading up to the Second World War. And just to perhaps quote or misquote Zhou Enlai, the former Chinese premier in the 1970s, when he was asked what he thought were the effects of the French Revolution, his response was, "It is too early to tell." And so we think that it may not take 200 years to understand the impacts of the COVID crisis on politics, but we think it's going to take years and potentially decades. And then on the right-hand side, it's just to highlight how for individual companies, one can, based on a understanding of what the big picture is, to trace out the particular impact on key stakeholder groups, which are already, I mean, with the game, or not the game, it's this process is just beginning, and huge changes already unfolding in each of these categories. So in terms of consumer demand, for example, in the sectors that we look at, oil and gas, clearly plummeting demand because of the lockdowns. Other commodities such as gold rising because people want to invest in gold because of the uncertainty. You have huge changes in government demands on companies, acceptance of a scale of government intervention in the economy that would make die-hard socialists, I think, blush had they tried to predict it just a month or so ago. And then, as you know, the very good work that WBCSD is doing in, on other topics, among the topics it's looking at around, you know, how should responsible companies be acting in response to the crisis. We see already a huge gap opening up between the leaders and the laggards in this space within the last several weeks, and I'm sure that will continue to unfold. So Filippo, if you could go to the next slide. So finally, our key 5 hypotheses. We first of all, and again, these are hypotheses, not predictions, and just a few highlights of them. We see the world entering a period of much deeper geopolitical uncertainty. We would like to think, I'm sure you would all like to think, and to Naoko's earlier point, that the COVID crisis will trigger much more international collaboration to tackle this and other crises. We sadly think that that is not likely, at least for not for the next couple of years, potentially longer, partly because the immediate trends prior to the COVID crisis were ones of growing great power rivalry between the US and China, between the US and Russia, and indeed between the US and Europe, of trade barriers being erected, of world leaders both stoking and paying much more attention to nationalist and populist currents, the machinery of international collaboration being eroded. But we think in the wake of the crisis, there'll be a very strong temptation for many world leaders to blame other countries, to blame foreigners, particularly if the economic crisis deepens. We think there's the temptation to play to populist sentiment will grow. The temptation to erect trade barriers further to protect domestic economies at the expense of the global economy will grow. Our second hypothesis, we think that host governments, again, particularly for resource companies, but potentially more broadly, they're just going to play tougher, particularly for existing investments. There will be many governments, as a result of their bailout programs, that will be looking extremely hard to raise more tax. The role, as mentioned, ideologically, there's much now more acceptance of significant government intervention in the economy for extractive projects, but also for other projects, you know, where capital is immobile. Governments will be will see you know, potentially them as rightly or wrongly as rich pickings, but also a desperation we see on government's part to attract more foreign investment. Hence, we talk about them governments singing sweeter for those investments that have yet to be made, and governments, I'm sure, looking to apply or offer sweet fiscal terms for new investments. Thirdly, we think that companies will come under a growing pressure to strike quite radical new deals with employees and communities. And while it is, of course, already the case that responsible companies have for long sought to treat their employees and communities well, we think that the COVID virus heightens significantly the cost of getting health interventions, corporate health interventions, wrong on the part of companies. Obviously, if employees become infected, companies are already finding they may need not just to change shift patterns and so on, but to shut operations down. If companies are, particularly this applies for remote operations, but if they are seen to be, through their employees and management that they fly into operations, seen to be a vector of the disease, and thereby communities get infected, we think that exposes companies not just to reputational damage, but potentially even to legal liability for the resulting community infections. And then once as we hope will happen soon, once a vaccine is developed and treatments are developed for the COVID virus, we suspect that many companies will feel the pressure and need to themselves help to deliver some of these treatments and vaccines for the very same reason that, particularly in remote regions where government capacity is lacking, that companies will be looked to, and the costs of companies not doing this will potentially be even higher. Thirdly, or I beg your pardon, fourthly, we think that there's going to be much more need within companies for sophisticated in-country management. Of course, in-country management, asset heads of major multinationals have already needed to be very, very competent, but we think that's going to be even more the case, partly because there'll be less ability for headquarters management to fly into remote operations, or indeed, even once travel bans are lifted, there's going to be a reluctance of headquarters management to be the globe-trotting executives that they once were. Therefore, in-country management will need to be trusted more, but also we see in-country management at the forefront of managing those growing national government pressures, the growing need to manage regional geopolitics if the world evolves more to a series of regional power blocks, as well as to bring up a theme that's already been mentioned a lot, as well as the in-country management needing to manage more of those localized, more resilient supply chains, which we suspect will be less in the hands of global procurement functions and more devolved to different countries. Fifthly and finally, we think that ESG pressures are going to come back with a vengeance alongside demands for corporate resilience. We already, obviously, in the pre-COVID era, had seen a very big increase in pressure from investors on ESG issues, as well as a lot of growing activism on climate change. Some people might think, well, with the economic crisis resulting from COVID, some of these pressures will go away as countries and people and companies focus on survival. But we think the opposite is likely to be the case, partly because there's very good momentum even now on these sorts of issues because of the work of WBCSD and other such organizations, but also perhaps, perhaps even more powerfully is that in the minds of many governments and many populations now, to Naoko's earlier point, there is a much clearer linkage, I think, in people's minds of the possibility that when the natural world collides with the human activity, some very, very severe crises can erupt, and people now have a visceral experience of such a crisis. So we think that's going to make government action and popular mobilization to prevent other crises much stronger. Government intervention is back, in particularly as already discussed with the talk of, which we hope is successful, of Green New Deals. And we think that the investor movement, which has so far focused on ESG, is going to fuse with demands for greater corporate resilience, whether it's resilience in terms of cash reserves of companies, resilience in terms of their supply chain, or resilience to withstand other pandemics and other crises like the climate crisis. So thank you very much. That's a rapid run through our hypotheses. I very much welcome your thoughts and questions, and these are just hypotheses. Thank you, Filippo.
Thank you so much. Rookie mistake of not unmuting. Thank you so much. As you emphasize hypotheses, and certainly interesting how you lay that out between the geopolitics, the host government side, the interaction with the host communities and employees, and the management implications that you outlined, but also the ESG agenda and the linkage to the resilience challenges that the other speakers were also alluding to. So thank you very much for those perspectives. And for those who are interested, of course, ask questions. I've seen a couple of questions being asked directly to the speakers. Please keep them under the to everyone so that we can all see the questions that you ask. But certainly interesting also to have that form of interaction in the chat function. And for those who are interested, we have, of course, also left the contact details of Daniel, and the slides will be made available, as I said before. Melis, certainly not last, but certainly not least, if I may say so. Melis represents Fujitsu, leading provider of IT services and solutions. And of course, as we talk about the acceleration of the transition to a more sustainable world and then the sort of a post-COVID world, technology has an incredibly important role to play, responsible implementation of technology, and technology with a sort of human-centric approach, which is the Fujitsu approach. So Mel, if I may call upon you to provide us with your thoughts on the back of what you have heard from your colleagues today.
Thank you very much, Filippo. Hopefully you can hear me clearly.
Yes, all good.
Great, and thank you for the opportunity to share a platform with so many great speakers today. I'll kick off, talk about, I mean, we've obviously have some fantastic insights so far, and Julian mentioned the briefing paper that's currently drafted and being looked at by various members of WBCSD, which was co-written with Volands, and I have to say it's a really well-balanced document and gives some fantastic insights as well, and I'll be reflecting on some of these themes which Julian also covered as part of my feedback today. But first of all, I guess we have to acknowledge the harsh reality of where we are at, the uncertainty and anxiety of this crisis, and it's hard to think about the decade ahead when even the next few days are filled with a fog obscuring the path to our new future and the new normal. And it's not just about the risk of infection in relation to isolation, but it's the short and medium term risks, and then also the long-term risks on working with citizens and our employees, on supporting them in terms of their mental and physical health due to those lockdowns and isolation. Even with a massive leap forward in the use of technology, where that technology is available to people, which does bring us closer together, for many people it's a cold comfort. And being denied that human contact, you know, being unable to hug your new grandchildren or see your lifelong friends, it can be quite devastating. And so that loneliness will test us. And then when offices and places of work start to reopen, the anxiety about open spaces, traveling on public transport, that will test us as well. And it also highlights the fact that there's the harsh reality of systemic inequalities. Previously independent people are now housebound. I think of people with underlying health conditions who were mobile but now are almost completely isolated, and people without access to green space or a garden, in cramped accommodation, unable to get privacy, and also the fact that domestic abuse, that which is reported, and I'm sure it's much higher, is very much on the increase during this crisis. And the WBCSD document does state that these inequalities are both between countries but also within them. COVID-19 is described as a great leveler, but clearly it isn't. The most vulnerable, the poorest in society, and key workers who cannot help but come into human contact are most at risk. But hard as it is right now, you know, we're here to talk about what we can do if we get things right and the future we might be able to build. And it is a huge opportunity on the back of this crisis and risk, not just for the next 10 years, but beyond as well. For example, we're looking at the Vision 2050 program within WBCSD. And hopefully what this crisis will teach us, not just as employees in private sector companies where we sit in positions of privilege, but as citizens of the world, that the two key tenets of the Vision 2050 program are the fundamentals to a sustainable future. And those two are, of course, living well, but also within planetary boundaries. And we talked about how private sector needs to reset their lens to measure value beyond short-term profit. And we talk about purpose. Now, purpose, some people will consider a bit of a buzzword, how it differentiates from traditional mission statements or vision statements. But it's about what we discussed, that the stakeholder-led approach rather than a shareholder one. Before Christmas, we had a very engaging session with WBCSD alongside Volands in Lausanne in Switzerland, where in his introductory speech, Peter Backer of WBCSD was clear, and I will paraphrase, but it went along the lines of, if capitalism isn't reformed or transformed, we will struggle to make any impact as part of our Vision 2050. The future of capitalism is the foundation of our house. And it's around the redefinition of value to an organization, as I mentioned. And if you look at integrated reports, generally, organizational integrated reports show and demonstrate the non-financial value next to financial value, but there's no harmony often between them. It's like two narratives that have been stitched together rather than something that has a good narrative flow. And it's around trying to bridge that gap to show that they're interdependent on each other. Fujitsu conducted an employee survey recently, and we asked our colleagues all around the world why they were proud to work for Fujitsu. And something that came out was the principle of meaningful work, and that came out as a real key theme. So understanding how you are contributing to society based on your work or your contribution is really key, and that's purpose. And when we look at purpose in a more broader societal context, what better place to start than with our key workers? They are being dragged into the forefront of the public consciousness. They are serving the direct purpose for society. Some of them are in the front line, directly saving lives in healthcare, doctors, nurses, care workers, but then there are others who perform core tasks, refuse collection, teachers, agricultural workers, emergency services, etc. And all of them are being recognized for their effort and sacrifice in this crisis, and all of them have roles which perform in sectors directly influencing outcomes relating to the Sustainable Development Goals. So one key trend could be that the recognition will go beyond public approval, and that fair salaries and a good standard of living will be a byproduct of this crisis due to that swell in recognition and public approval. No longer will they be taken for granted. Another area to look at is the importance of diverse leadership and diverse teams. We have seen there is a correlation how governments run by women are handling the crisis in a much more holistic, people-centric way. Germany, New Zealand, Taiwan are amongst those global leaders. 3 countries also with very diverse geography and demographics. And we know that diverse teams and diverse leadership generate diverse thought, better ways to deliver solutions, leading into solutions for global problems if we harness that diversity correctly. And going beyond gender, we can look to harness other areas of inclusion, disability, LGBT, ethnicity, and also opportunities for those with great potential but little opportunity, all because they are not born into the money or means to give them that first step on the ladder. Another area, we've discussed it as part of the call, relates to climate change. With a reduction in road and air traffic, the air is cleaner in many cities worldwide as part of this lockdown. I read Milan are looking to pedestrianise their city centre as part of their tentative efforts to reopen the city and introduce 35 kilometres of cycle lanes. I don't think this will be temporary. This may end up a permanent fixture in city centres worldwide, leading to cleaner, more human-centric, more well-being enabled town centres. But that comes with the side effect of the systemic shock to key industries. And if we look at the airline industry, for instance, it accounts for 3.6% of global GDP. And if it were a country, that would be the 20th biggest in the world. The IATA estimate 5.6 million jobs are at risk, which I would assume includes the airline industry supply chain too. In the last 24 hours, British Airways made up to 12,000 people redundant, and they predict it may take years to achieve the same demand for flights as in pre-crisis times. And this leads into the discussion on the future of work. We're already talking about the impact on the future of work based on digitalization and automation and how we can adapt and be proactive in offering opportunities as part of this current industrial revolution. But what about the new jobs that we need for employees in industries severely disrupted through this pandemic? So that is also going to be a key consideration moving forward. On digitalization itself, companies, including Fujitsu, well, those which are fortunate enough where it's our business or are able to continue to trade and also be able to maintain employees with minimal disruption, are finding that employees are equally effective whether working from home or working from the office. In the future, it may lead to less necessity to travel, to commute and pollute, and we won't need to do that as part of the new normal. For example, the Vision 2050 meeting that we were due to have in Singapore was repurposed with an online workshop, and it was really successful. And it was also an opportunity to be able to include more members of my team, for instance. Ordinarily, it would have been a layer of middle management that would have attended the workshop, but I was able to bring in members of my team to add some new opinions and adding to the debate online. And it was a really engaging, lively debate, online polls, and really well managed. And I think it was a huge success. And circumstances led us into a new way to deliver an outcome, and it worked really well. And finally, collaboration. I mean, it almost doesn't need to be said. It's implicit in everything we do, but its absence would be stark if I didn't mention it. But collaboration, we can't do this alone. No organization, no government can do this alone. We're already seeing that rival companies are ploughing their resources together, sharing IPR, and coming up with ways of coming to terms with or looking for solutions, building opportunities for vaccine research, building ventilators, helping smaller manufacturers industrialize, being able to make more of the key medical equipment that they need. And I foresee that this will hopefully continue as we move into the future, you know, pandemic or not. It's going to involve more collaboration, and you know, hopefully, where the current populist trend and protectionist trend is on the uptake in our governments worldwide, perhaps this will help us to build that better future together. And clearly, organisations such as WBCSD is an example of where we can combine our key skills to benefit society. So that was my final point. Thank you, Filippo.
Thank you, Mel. Always interesting to listen to your insights spanning so many areas, including the diversity angle, which I think was very interesting. That you highlighted also the adaptability angle and what you discussed around reimagining work, including workflows, of course. So thank you very much to Mel and to the Fujitsu team overall for its long-standing support of all of the work of WBCSD, including on Vision 2050. We are getting very close to the 30, so you know, I'm unfortunately Swiss and I'd like to close up on time, but I would like to maybe call upon Naoko Ishii, if I may. I see you're still there, and you know, we've talked about business leadership at the outset, and the importance of leadership sort of comes through in all of the perspectives that you have heard. Is there maybe one particular message that you have to this audience in terms of what would you expect from business? What do you need from business? What would you call upon the community of WBCSD to really drive forward in this totally changed 2020? We went from being a super year for nature into a new kind of year. What would be your one single short, possibly message to all of us in the community as we take this work forward?
Thank you so much. Well, one thing I really like to get out of this community is really that it's a combination of not just the narrative, which we already talked about, but also the action together. I still believe that we are fighting that is the critical the social tipping points to go which way. So the one mentioning that I think that the Ben or somebody mentioned that the rescue versus recovery. Yeah. And I clearly like to see this green recovery is a real green recovery. So what's the disciplines in it? What's the goal in it? And what we should do and what we shouldn't do, and how we can galvanize our goodwill and actions together to ensure that the green recovery is not the recovery then back to the old business, but what are the narrative, what are the science, what are the action points together. I would like to see that very kind of tangible the package going forward. And I have a really high hope this group that we already have a lot of common things in common can come up with that fully phrased package just in time. Not just in case, but just in time delivery. That's what I'd like to see from this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naoko Ishii, and thank you so much for that perspective, and thank you, of course, to all of our speakers whom you see depicted here on this particular slide. Thank you for having taken the time, for sharing your perspectives, for keeping them short and manageable, also to fit into a 90-minute format that we outlined for today. We heard a lot around, the big picture perspective provided by Julian on the back of the feedback of members on how to shape such an issue brief. We heard about the acceleration of change, of system change. We heard about rescue and recovery packages with a low carbon angle. We heard on resource companies, the angles thereof, and of course also a perspective around the role of technology and reflections there by our colleague from Fujitsu on a number of topics whom you just heard. So thank you so much for this diversity and richness of perspectives, which we thought would be interesting for sharing in the wider WBCSD community as part of this virtual event series. Please watch your inbox as we wrap up the session. Watch your inbox tomorrow for the key takeaways, the slides, and the recording. We will make it available to all of you, and make it, of course, available also on the event's website. Please also watch this space for the 2 issue briefs that we have discussed. The issue briefs looking at the decade ahead at the level of macro trends and disruptions, and at the level of the long-term, the decade-long implications of the COVID crisis, the COVID pandemic. What does it really mean for the decade ahead? On the back of this webinar, we are going to do a bit more work on refining some of the narrative and messages and share with all of you publicly. Lastly, please watch out also for the WBCSD web platform that we have set up around COVID-19. If you're a company who would like to share your ongoing work, you're more than welcome to contact us. You're also more than welcome to look at the variety of insights, tools, and thought leadership, best practice cases, and other issues that we have positioned there in that particular web platform. There's over 120 examples already of business initiatives and solutions in direct response. And of course, on our side, we will continue to drive the work around the COVID-19 response program alongside all of our colleagues in the various WBCSD teams across the world. So with that said, with I think a couple of minutes of delay, but still relatively on time, I have nothing left to say but to say thank you to all of you. Thank you to our speakers. On behalf of Julian and myself, thank you for taking the time. Also, of course, to all of the participants who joined us today for both sessions. It's a pleasure to interact with all of you and to be able to engage, even if only virtually right now and for the foreseeable future. Please stay safe and take care of yourselves and, of course, your loved ones and your colleagues and communities. And we look forward to being in touch over the weeks and months to come, of course, as these events unfold and as our work advances. So thank you again, and wishing you all a good day, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are across the world. Thank you again, and see you again soon.